reservoir. Oh, Kramer's got some down there. All right, are we good to go? Welcome, everyone. I'd like to call this joint commission special meeting for the City Council and the City Planning Commission to order. It is June 30th. We are at 9:02 a.m. in the Clearlake City Council Chambers located 14050 Olympic Drive in Clearlake, California for this special meeting and training. Mr. Flora, would you like to introduce the topic and our schedule for the day?
Sure. So, Mr. Mayor, council members, planning commissioners, we organized this as a training on AB 52, the law enacted in 2015 related to tribal consultation. And so we have asked Lisa Westwood, who is a registered professional archaeologist, vice president and director of cultural resources for eCore Consulting. She's been working with the city for almost a year now, related to tribal policy and whatnot. So, and then we've also coordinated with Mr. Robert Geary, who is a tribal sword preservation officer for Habimatal Pomo of Upper Lake, as well as the Koi Nation. And so with this, I'll just turn over to.
Well, I'd just like to kind of thank you for setting the ground rules. We've got a lot of people here who are in on their day off, a lot of folks that are volunteering their time. So I wanted to thank them for being present so we can all be on the same page moving forward. This is an important topic. And at that point, I think to officially get started, I'd like the city clerk to call the roll and we can have our pledge and then we'll get started with the presentation.
All right. Councilmember Slotin.
Here.
Councilmember Kramer.
Here.
Vice Mayor Claffey.
Here.
Mayor Purdock.
Here.
And for the Planning Commission, Commissioner Inglis
Here.
and Vice Chair Stewart.
Here.
Chair Williams. Here. And I believe that Commissioner Smalley is on the Zoom.
I am.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Vice Chair Stewart, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yes, sir. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, moving on to item C1, presentation by Lisa Westwood for this meeting. Lisa.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, this workshop is being presented as a collaborative effort between tribal cultural resources experts and professional archaeologists representing the Koi Nation of Northern California, the Habimatal Pomo of Upper Lake, and eCore Consulting. We're really pleased to be here and appreciate everyone's time. Robert and I are very honored to be here to present a workshop on tribal consultation. And I want to extend a sincere thank you to the City of Clearlake and City Manager Alan Flora for making this space available. This is an important topic. And personally, I've given over 120 of these workshops to date. And today's workshop is by far the most diverse and holistic set of attendees to date. So I'm really excited to be here this morning. The people that we have in attendance today include elected officials, appointed officials, heads of departments and sister agencies, and tribal council members and representatives from at least 5 culturally affiliated tribes in the area. Thank you so much for all of you making time to be here today on your day off. And I would now like to ask Dino Beltran from the Koi Nation of Northern California to address the group.
So let's go from right here?
If you could, step up to the mic, that way people that are not present in the room can hear you a little better. Thank you, sir.
I need to turn around because I'm typing. All right. Last time didn't work out. So. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Does that work? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, City of Clear Lake, for getting this going. We appreciate it. The aspects of making sure we get policies and we're following the law and whatever other attributes that are associated with this are a valuable thing. We all have checklists we have to take care of. We all have responsibilities we have to take care of, but it's within the details. Read between the lines. What exactly we're trying to accomplish here. I can speak on behalf of my crew, because my crew is here, and I know some of the others. I know Michael, all right, and some of the other folks from the tribal communities. I don't see Cass here yet, but I know what's in their heart. Okay, for us, it's not a tangible thing, and I know a lot of folks have to see numbers. They have to see perimeters. They have to see an actual thing of substance. They actually have to see a human remain. They have to see an actual piece of obsidian to call it a TCR. And that to a certain point makes sense, but to us as Native Americans, it's more than that. It's a spiritual thing. I've been brought up to not judge anybody's spirituality. That's not our business. But when you're talking with somebody, you can tell whether or not they have that connection to Creator or their ancestors. And it's that connection, that thing that's not tangible, that what we relate to. So I just wanted to let folks know that in this society, July 4th is coming up, a lot of celebration going on. A lot of folks are happy about hot dogs, apple pie, driving a Chevrolet pickup truck. And that's the American culture. To idolize a hot dog doesn't make sense to us. To glorify a piece of pie doesn't really make sense to us, but to make sure we're taking care of the ancestors does. Again, thanks for putting this on, Alan. I'm glad you put this on your checklist, and hopefully from this point forward, we can relearn something. I know every time I see this presentation, I learn something new, or I know I've forgotten something. So hopefully that's going to ring true, and that spiritual component will have some type of a moral value. So we're also doing things from that standpoint as well. So thank you. I'm going to say a prayer in our language, if we can. Oko hek we bastoted, mabate will let obai withi shiskit, uyukat tsamalwalka, witbak tsanu tsamal kuboka. Kohek we mabate will ukat tsalet, mabate will ukat alet. Wiumtum fobatakit tadwa kanokana, pamdalwa, yehake ana. Oemek we bastoted, mabate will let. Kohek we bastoted. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dino. I very much appreciate those words. We acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the ancestral land of the Khoi, Elam, and Lake Miwok, who have inhabited this region for thousands of years and have had deep cultural, historical, and spiritual connections to the land. We acknowledge and respect them as the traditional custodians of this land and recognize these native sovereign nations as the original and ongoing stewards of these lands. It is a pleasure to be here. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Lisa Westwood, as Alan kindly introduced me earlier. I'm the Vice President and Director of Cultural Resources for eCorp Consulting. I'm a registered professional archaeologist, and in fact, am the president-elect of the Register of Professional Archaeologists. The Register is the only worldwide certification program and credentialing organization for professional archaeologists. Right now, I have 28 years of experience working in archaeology and cultural resources management, and I am also on the faculty in the departments of anthropology at California State University and Butte College. As Alan mentioned, I'm also a consultant for the city of Clearlake, but I am here on my own time to support the city and the tribes in developing a stronger tribal consultation relationship. I am also, during my regular days, regularly work with agencies and tribes across the state and have developed a number of standard operating procedures and guidelines for various jurisdictions. And I'm currently helping the city of Clearlake doing that as well. So I'm very happy to be here. Today's objective is to really learn about government to government consultation and the fundamentals of that tribal consultation process. I will begin by presenting information about the requirements under state and federal law and the things that the agencies have to comply with. We're then going to take a 10-minute break, and then after that, Robert will take over and put those laws and those requirements into context, and he's going to provide some insight from the tribe's perspectives. And following this workshop, I will be providing these slides to City Manager Flora for distribution to the attendees. So you'll have these for future reference if you would like, to be able to turn back to or to share with others that maybe were not able to be here. One of the terms that you've probably heard is government to government consultation. I want to break that term down into two important concepts. The first piece is consultation. And it helps to understand that legal definition in state law, because this is really the foundation of the relationship between culturally affiliated tribes and agencies. The term consultation is actually defined in the California Government Code. It's a meaningful and timely process of seeking and considering the views of others while respecting cultural values. And state law actually requires mutually respectful consultation and care for confidentiality. And for that reason, today's workshop materials intentionally omit the locations of sensitive resources. We want to make sure that we are not disclosing sensitive information. The second key piece of this term is the government to government part. And it's important to recognize that tribes are sovereign nations and they have self-determination. Just like counties, just like the federal government, tribal sovereignty is a term that refers to basically a legal recognition by the federal government of the inherent sovereignty that tribes have on their own, and that sovereign powers that they have to make their own laws, to levy taxes, and to have their own tribal justice system. So they are basically in control of their own process and their decision-making. Government to government means that the agency and the tribe are communicating and interfacing just like they would if the city was talking to Caltrans or when the state talks to BLM. In California, the government to government consultation is actually required under state law. Assembly Bill 52, you've probably heard of this. It was passed in 2014 and it took effect July 1, 2015. It basically amended the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. So when we say AB 52, we actually mean CEQA. What it did when it amended CEQA was it mandated tribal consultation at the beginning of the environmental review process so that the effects of the effects to tribal cultural resources are taken into account, just like all other aspects of the environment that we're used to. AB 52 also established that tribes are the experts in tribal cultural resources. And so while archaeologists like myself can suggest a resource is a tribal cultural resource, such a designation does need to have the concurrence of the culturally affiliated tribe or the tribal expert. And more importantly, as you're going to learn today, there are some forms of tribal cultural resources that cannot be identified by anyone other than a tribal expert, because they're not always archaeological. Now, this concept of expert is not something that's new to CEQA. I think we're all familiar with this. We are already accustomed to the idea of seeking expert opinion when we need to evaluate the impacts of a project on the environment. So, for example, if we need to assess the effect that a project will have on traffic volumes, in the community. We seek out a traffic expert to do a study and figure out what the impact is going to be. And similar with biologists and geologists, and tribal experts and tribal historic preservation officers are the comparable experts for tribal cultural resources, much like I, as an archaeologist, am the subject matter expert for archaeology. So very similar. When AB 52 amended CEQA, it did a number of other things as well. It defined for the first time a tribal cultural resource. We call them TCRs for short. And this is a term that means something in state law, and it's defined in the Public Resources Code. And I've placed the entire definition here for your reference. But this definition of what constitutes a tribal cultural resource for the purposes of CEQA can be met in one of three ways. If the site is, or if the resource is included in or eligible for inclusion in the California Register of Historical Resources, or if it's on a local register and it has cultural value to a tribe, then it can be considered a TCR for the purposes of state law. Either of these criteria are typically in place whenever the TCR is archaeological in form. That's very common, but not all tribal cultural resources are archaeological. If a tribe provides substantial evidence for the presence of a TCR, the lead agency can consider it a TCR for the purposes of CEQA. And Robert is going to go into the concept of substantial evidence with tribal cultural resources a little later. So we're going to come back to that topic. But state law also differentiates between a couple of other things. It says that if the tribal cultural resource is a cultural landscape, which is basically a combination of natural and cultural features kind of spread out across a larger area, then it can also be considered a tribal cultural resource, but it has to be geographically defined in terms of size and scope under state law. In other words, there needs to be some kind of delineation so that the process under CEQA can play out. That is, all of you as lead agencies have to determine that a TCR is present, and then you have to assess whether or not there's going to be an impact on that TCR, and then impose measures to either avoid, minimize, or mitigate those impacts. The tribal experts are the ones that help with that determination. And lastly, state law also acknowledges that tribal cultural resources may not rise to the level of being a quote unquote unique archaeological site under CEQA. For example, you may have an archaeological resource that is dismissed as being not important under CEQA for whatever reason, but it still may be considered a TCR. So in other words, archaeological sites and tribal cultural resources, they have some similarities. They may also be different, and there are different thresholds for what's considered significant for each type of resource. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I think it's important to start out, though, with understanding why this consultation is important. And really, this kind of consideration of tribal cultural resources in environmental review is really no different than what you're doing already under CEQA for other things, like biology, traffic, noise. If you think about, for a moment, an environmental review for a new shopping center, the lead agency first has to hire experts to study traffic and noise and other aspects of the environment. And then they have to explain what's there in the project area and how that proposed project is going to affect those aspects of the environment. And the traffic engineer is going to recommend measures to cut out or cut down on the traffic jams. And the state legislature in 2014 said the same goes for tribal cultural resources. So you need to talk to the experts to understand what's there or what might be there, and basically consider the recommendations for how to avoid or reduce those impacts. And so for this reason, CEQA requires that the tribes be engaged early in the process. And this actually, believe it or not, actually helps reduce the cost. It helps avoid impacts and helps with preservation in place. And it actually can really do a good job of streamlining that process when the tribes are engaged early. And as I'll mention in a moment, there is actually a mandated process under CEQA now for the sequence of events and the timing of consultation outreach. And it's designed with this in mind, with this overarching goal in mind, and that is to make sure that there isn't an unexpected or unnecessary impact or higher costs and so on. Now, one thing that is important to think about with respect to the CEQA process is another consideration, and that has to do with categorical exemptions. It's something that is used oftentimes by agencies for smaller projects, and it's important to recognize that already under CEQA, even before there was a tribal cultural resource considered as part of the checklist, one cannot use a CADX under certain circumstances that may be triggered by TCRs. The first one is the exception to the exemption. So basically this means that you can't use a categorical exemption under CEQA if there's going to be a project that's going to have a substantial adverse change in the significance of a historical resource. And as we'll learn today, there's a high likelihood that TCRs are also historical resources under CEQA. So it may trigger the exception to the exemption, and you can't use a categorical exemption. The second type of consideration is that a categorical exemption can't be used if there's a reasonable possibility that the activity will have a significant effect on the environment due to what's considered unusual circumstances. And there are a lot of things about tribal cultural resources that can be unusual, or at least not something that we've dealt with often in the past. And so these are things to think about, and agencies are really having to reevaluate their use of categorical exemptions as a result of these things. Now, speaking of laws, there are a lot of state and federal laws that mandate tribal consultation. As you can see from this matrix, these are all the ways that tribes are involved in your projects. And not all of these laws are going to apply to every project, but it is, in my experience, very common for there to be at least 2, maybe sometimes 3 of these mechanisms. And time today does not permit a deep dive into all of these, and it would not be helpful to go into a lot of detail on all of these. So I'm just really going to highlight a few that are germane to the attendees today. The ones that you as lead agencies and tribes are usually going to be engaging under for typical projects. And these fall into 2 categories. So we've got state laws and we've got federal laws. And I've already touched on AB 52, and I'm going to continue that. I'm going to go a little bit more in detail on that one. Then we have Senate Bill 18, Assembly Bill 168. And then on the federal side, we have NEPA, and we have Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So I'm going to briefly touch on these, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the requirements that agencies have under each of these at a relatively high level today. Now, I mentioned earlier AB 52 amended CEQA in 2014. And basically, it added a tribal consultation process and added a new environmental topic that has to be addressed. That's what TCRs are. The last time that CEQA was amended in a similar way was when greenhouse gases were added to the CEQA checklist. And some of you might recall what happened at that time. There were a lot of questions, like how do we analyze this? To what extent do we analyze this? Who analyzes this? And how does this differ from air quality, which is a different section on the CEQA checklist? And there was definitely a learning curve for those of us that are around and practicing in the CEQA world at that time. I think there was a learning curve for the whole industry. There was a learning curve for agencies and experts trying to adapt to this new environmental consideration under CEQA. And AB 52 did something very similar. It added a new environmental issue that's not the same as cultural resources. And it's most definitely not the same as paleontological resources. It's a separate consideration under CEQA. So it's another section of that CEQA checklist that needs to be addressed using the appropriate experts, just like everything else. And what AB 52 did was to establish some very specific thresholds and timelines. The one thing that it did is it says that a substantial adverse change to a tribal cultural resource constitutes a significant effect on the environment. And so if that effect cannot be reduced to less than significant, then it may require the preparation of an EIR. So that does have an effect on agency decision-making and processes for discretionary projects. It also established these milestones. It says that within 14 days of the beginning of the project or when the lead agency has decided it is ready to undertake CEQA, you have to notify the tribes of an opportunity to consult. And I've cited the Public Resources Code sections for future reference if you'd like to go look those up on your own. But there are other milestones as well. So once you've notified tribes of that opportunity to consult within 14 days, once a tribe responds within 30 days, you have to initiate consultation with that tribe within 30 days of that response. It also affects the timing of the release of your CEQA document. So you cannot release an environmental document until that consultation, if it was requested by a tribe, has been initiated. And so accordingly, you can't certify or adopt an environmental document until consultation, if it was initiated, has concluded. These are really important thresholds. It becomes very important to track these and make sure that you're sending out the notices at the right time and realizing that your CEQA document process is affected by this. And that's intentional. When you think about it, if there is an impact, if there is a TCR present, you have to address that in your CEQA document before you circulate it for public review. If you were to circulate it before that were to happen, which is how it was done in the old days before TCRs were an issue with AB 52, you could get to the point where you're all the way down the road in a CEQA process and you're getting towards the end, and then all of a sudden you realize that there's a TCR in the project area and you're faced with costly redesigns. It costs a lot of money to design projects and all of the infrastructure that goes in to support it. So it is the intent of AB 52 and CEQA to front end load that process by having the tribal consultation early, so that if there are things that need to be avoided or preserved or dealt with, you have the ability to do that early on before you are locked into design and you've spent a lot of money. So there's some method to the madness, so to speak. It's also important to recognize that you still have to have a TCR analysis, even if there are no tribes that consulted. Every once in a while, you'll have a situation where tribes did not respond and did not request consultation. Lead agencies still have to address the impacts to tribal cultural resources, even if that happened. And that is usually done through drawing from other lines of evidence. There's other sources of information that could be drawn from in order to make that impact determination. But just saying because no tribes came to the table, there are no tribal cultural resources present is not actually consistent with CEQA. And then lastly, your TCR analysis in your environmental document must identify and then avoid, preserve in place, or mitigate impacts to TCRs if present. This is no different than any of the other environmental areas. When you think about biology and archaeology, very similar. Now, there's another law that you may come across that is different than CEQA, outside of CEQA, and it's called Senate Bill 18. And this was passed about a decade before AB 52. And this only pertains to general plan or specific plan adoptions or amendments, or to the dedication of open space. Sometimes these types of actions happen in conjunction with CEQA and AB 52. For example, if you're going to be adopting a new general plan, you're going to be doing an EIR to support the adoption of a new general plan. In that case, you're doing Senate Bill 18 and AB 52. They are not the same thing. Sometimes you may be doing something that is consistent with a specific plan EIR that was already analyzed under a specific plan EIR, and you're just making an administrative change to perhaps some of the general plan designations. And so you would go through a Senate Bill 18, but not an AB 52. So it can get a little bit complicated sometimes, but really you look at what are the triggers for these consultations. And the types of tribes that you're talking to may be different under each of the circumstances. And when I showed you that matrix earlier, it was a very complicated table with a lot of different laws in which tribes can become involved in projects. All of those things have different timelines, different thresholds, have different requirements, and may have different tribes involved. And what I mean by that is that if you go by the letter of AB 52, The consultation list that agencies use is populated by tribes who have put in a formal request to an agency to be added to the AB 52 list. Not all tribes have done that. And so when Senate Bill 18 comes along, what a lot of agencies will do is they'll send off for a list to the NAHC and get a list of consulting tribes. That list, and even if they do that for AB 52, is going to be different than a list generated by an agency that is populated by tribes that have requested it. So the short answer is you may be talking with different tribes in different circumstances, but a lot of them overlap and they're very common. You should know who you normally are talking to. Now, the goals of Senate Bill 18 consultation are a little bit different than CEQA. And that's largely because, I think, because when you're talking about CEQA, you're usually talking about approving a project. And when you're talking about Senate Bill 18, this is really forward-thinking planning in a lot of cases. When it comes to general plans and specific plans, and specifically, you're looking ahead. And so sometimes what you're looking at is where are the typical Native American cultural places that the tribes associate with? How do we develop land use designations early on so that we can preserve these in place? There are different timelines also associated with Senate Bill 18. So you recall when I talked about AB 52, there was a 14-day notice, and then you have to initiate consultation within 30 days of receiving the request. And after that, there are no more timelines. But on Senate Bill 18, the initial response window for tribes is 90 days. And then after that, there are noticing requirements that are required by the government code. 45 days out from the city council hearing to approve the action under consideration, a notice has to go out, and then another notice goes out 10 days prior. So you can see there's a little bit different noticing requirements as well. So it can be a little hard to track everything. And that's why for developing the City of Clear Lake's tribal consultation guidelines, we're developing a series of checklists and tracking forms to help city staff really be able to manage these deadlines and make sure that we're giving the tribes the opportunity at the right time, that we're making sure we're taking all of these things into consideration during the decision-making process. And similar to AB 52, the city could not take action on that general plan or specific plan adoption or amendment until that noticing, consultation, and referral process has all happened. Now, why this is important is that the use of Senate Bill 18 and tribal consultation helps avoid impacts to tribal cultural resources long before a property is actually proposed for development. So when we think about it, when you're going through the process of setting, for example, the general plan, you're looking 20 years ahead, and you're looking at where do we want to put various types of development. And we might be looking at a map and say, wow, we'd really like to be able to place maybe some residential housing right here, for example, at this little peninsula. And the city were to go through Senate Bill 18 consultation and learn that there are some really, really sensitive areas right there that have some pretty significant resources. And so this would be an opportunity to actually do something now in terms of setting aside certain areas or reclassifying certain areas so that in the future they can be kept in open space, or they can be designed so that any kind of projects that are going to occur in those places are going to have some predetermined mitigation measures that'll ensure that these resources are preserved or not damaged in the process of future development. So it really actually is a good tool, Senate Bill 18 is, because it's so forward thinking in most cases. And it reduces those conflicts later because we know ahead of time where those sensitive areas are. I've worked with a lot of tribes as part of guidelines and standard operating procedures to develop these types of sensitivity maps that can be drawn. These are not maps that are going to say, this is exactly where the resource is, because as we'll learn today, not all resources can be pinpointed with accuracy right now. And I'm going to come back to that topic in a little bit. But this kind of a sensitivity map gives you an idea for is there more likely to be something and less likely, and you can make informed decisions about land use early on. Another type of, and this is the last of the state laws I'm going to talk about, another law that requires consultation is relatively new. This is called AB 168. AB 168 was actually passed in 2020. Many of you may be aware of Senate Bill 35 projects, which is the law that introduced the concept of ministerial approval for these affordable multifamily housing development projects. And for those that are not in planning, ministerial basically is to some extent the opposite of discretionary approval. So discretionary approval means a lead agency has the ability to say no and deny the project. They have discretion as to whether or not they will approve the project, and discretionary projects are subject to CEQA review unless they are statutorily exempt. On the other hand, ministerial approval means that if somebody were to meet certain requirements right off the bat, the city or the lead agency can't say no to the project. They have to approve it. It's kind of like pulling a pool permit or a permit to put in a fence. If you filled out the form, you paid your fee, you met all the requirements, you're done. You're at the permit counter, you get your permit and you walk away and you do your project. You don't go through CEQA. That's what ministerial is. In 2017, the state legislature passed Senate Bill 35 that said for certain projects that are for affordable multifamily housing, those should be treated as ministerial projects, meaning they don't go through CEQA review. Now, the threshold for being eligible to use Senate Bill 35 housing is pretty high. You know, there's a whole series of musts and must nots that you have to meet in order to be able to be eligible for this. But and a lot of agencies are looking at this as an opportunity to meet some of their RENA targets. A lot of agencies are looking to this. The problem with that the legislature recognized before passing AB 168 is that nothing on this list addresses tribal cultural resources. So projects were going forward or there was a potential for projects to go forward and impact tribal cultural resources without going through CEQA review. So the legislature passed AB 168 in 2020, basically to fix that problem. And the concern and the reason for passing it was that, you know, what it basically is doing is it is adding a scoping consultation process to this ministerial approval processing. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that here in a minute, but it essentially ensures that tribal cultural resources are taken into account before that whole ministerial process kicks off. And so we'll talk a little bit here about some differences. Now, when you're talking about AB 52, which is the CEQA, if you were going through CEQA, these are some of the things that we address as part of that consultation. Tribal cultural resources are going to be on a local, state, or national historic registry, or if there's substantial evidence and you take into account the significance of the tribe. I mentioned that earlier. Consultation, because of those timelines, is happening in parallel with processing the application and CEQA. So lead agencies are oftentimes working on other parts of a CEQA document while consultation is going on. And sometimes there are changes to the project design or the project description as a result of other kind of constraints. It might be there's an issue with noise, and so you need to set back the housing a little bit so that you create a larger buffer between the nearest sensitive receptors, for example. Those kinds of changes to the project description under CEQA usually just get carried out and handled in step with the consultation. And developers and consultants are oftentimes assisting the agency, and they can participate in that consultation if there's no objection from the consulting tribe. And agencies have a lot of discretion in key locations in CEQA, in terms of making decisions while they're considering tribal input. And you have to conclude, as I mentioned, you have to conclude consultation with or without agreement after reasonable and good faith effort. And then the city or the lead agency can take action on their CEQA document. Now, in comparison, AB 168 presents different thresholds. AB 168 adds to the criteria for what's considered a TCR can also be something that's on a tribal historic registry. That's something that's not a consideration under AB 52. The entire scoping consultation process for these ministerial projects have to be completed before an applicant can even apply for Senate Bill 35 approval. Because once they apply for Senate Bill 35 approval, the lead agency has to issue the approval. No CEQA. So this consultation process has been inserted into the process right before the applicant actually applies. It's like pre-consultation. That's why it's called scoping consultation. And it says as well that if you have changes to the project, you have to restart consultation. So they're not handled in step. Participation of developers and consultants have to be improved by the tribe in writing before they can be there. And agencies do not have any discretion. In order for an agency to utilize Senate Bill 35 ministerial approval, the agency must come to an agreement with the consulting tribe. Otherwise, it is not eligible for Senate Bill 35. And what that means is then the applicant can go back to the agency and file a development application and go through CEQA. And then they will be going through AB 52 at that time. So the thresholds are very different under AB 168. And it's important that agencies who are potentially processing these Senate Bill 35 ministerial streamlined housing projects are aware of these. Now, just briefly on the federal laws that may apply to any given project. Many of you are already familiar with NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA is very much like a counterpart to CEQA, but it's on the federal end. And it affects local projects if the federal agency has what's called a handle. Is there something that a federal agency is approving, or do they have some kind of hook on the project? They have to go through the process of determining whether or not there is a significant effect to, or an adverse effect to significant or non-significant cultural resources. One of the big, I think, misnomers about NEPA is that it's only addressing significant cultural resources, and that's not actually entirely true. NEPA considers a much broader field of cultural resources that considers significant and non-significant ones. And NEPA requires that federal agencies actually go through that process of determining whether or not something's there and take measures ahead of time, very similar to CEQA. But where the local projects are going to have is usually some kind of a nexus related to funding or permitting, something along those lines, or some kind of assistance. When we talk about joint documents, we're talking about CEQA and NEPA together. And that might be because it's, for example, a housing development project that's subject to CEQA review, but then maybe there might be some housing grant money being provided by HUD, federal agency. That's one circumstance where you may have both federal and state involvement. Caltrans is another example where you oftentimes are going to have CEQA and NEPA. And sometimes they're joint documents and sometimes they're separate documents. But the point is that that process of going through and evaluating impacts has to occur by both agencies separately. The other federal law that many people have heard about, though, is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. This one actually is much more visible in the cultural resources world because there's a very, very robust program for Native American tribal consultation. Again, this is being done by the federal agencies. They're the ones that have the responsibility to comply with this. But if you have a project that needs a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, or you're getting highway bridge program funding through Caltrans or Federal Highways Administration money passing down, or you need some kind of a permit from, or, something from the US Bureau of Reclamation or any other type of federal agency, this applies. Basically, it just means that the federal agency, before actually giving the funding or the permit or the assistance or the authorization, before they do that, they have to take into account the effects that their undertaking would have on historic properties. And they have to consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer, any other consulting parties, and Native American tribes. That process does not take the place of everything else that applies. Again, these are all separate procedures. And while in some cases you can do NEPA in lieu of Section 106, that's not really commonly done. It does not replace, though, the CEQA process. Okay, now that we understand kind of the general legal context that agencies have to work within, let's talk a little bit about how tribal cultural resources differ from or are similar to archaeological sites and historical resources. This is a very important distinction because this is what really consultation is coming down to in many cases. There are similarities, and I want to start out with those. Sometimes tribal cultural resources are archaeological in form. Archaeological sites, by definition, basically is anything that is made, modified, or moved by a human that's generally more than 45 years of age or older. And archaeological sites, as I described to my students at Chico State and Butte College, archaeological sites are like the tip of the iceberg. So what you see on the surface does not necessarily represent the distribution of materials and remnants of ancient human culture below the surface. When you look at the tip of the iceberg concept, and you may have a couple of artifacts on the surface, and everything else is below, you don't know the extent of how far below the surface it goes, horizontally or vertically, unless there's testing done or some kind of excavation, or unfortunately it's encountered during ground disturbing activities. Then if you have a situation where it's on a piece of property and somebody has walked across the property and has seen maybe a member of the public, and has seen some artifacts on the ground, and unfortunately they pick it up and they take it with them. Well, first of all, there are many, many laws that govern whether or not you can pick up artifacts, and in most cases, it's illegal. We're not going to go into all of that now, but what happens is the one indicator that there's something below the surface is no longer there. Or perhaps there was plowing, maybe it's in an ag field, and now the artifacts are displaced. We no longer have a surface indicator for what's down there. And oftentimes, when we do a record search at the information centers, we can get some information about things that have been seen in the vicinity, and we can kind of make a educated guess about where there might be archaeological sites, but we don't always know. And I think it's important to recognize too, and I think the state legislature recognized this as well, that when it comes to burials in cemeteries, I think the original CEQA guidelines used to present those as formal cemeteries. So on the left of your screen, you see the CEQA checklist. I've circled the word dedicated. This is the new word for the CEQA checklist. It used to say, would the project disturb any human remains, including those interred outside of formal cemeteries? That word was conveying, I think, a Euro-American perception of what a cemetery is. Headstone, fake flowers, little benches. And the reality is that Native American culture did not bury their ancestors using headstones and fake flowers and benches. And because there was no written record written down like Europeans think it's written down, the exact locations aren't always precisely known. Now, there's a lot of tribal knowledge that's passed on from generation to generation. A lot of tribes will say, we have an idea, it's really close to this location, but we don't know exactly where it is. Same thing that I say as an archaeologist when I know that there's been a site recorded in this area, but I don't know exactly the extent, because unlike biologists who can see the plants and see the habitat above the ground, we can't see below the ground. So we deal with a lot of things like sensitivities. So in other words, these things, these resources may be in the area, but they may be unmarked. And so when the CEQA guidelines were changed, they changed the word formal to dedicated, because just because it's not a quote unquote formal cemetery doesn't mean that it's not dedicated for burial of remains. So getting back to tribal cultural resources, sometimes they are archaeological. They might be the remains of villages or resource gathering areas. They might be temporary camps. They might be food processing locations, because oftentimes humans would gather or hunt the animals and the plants at their location of where they were, where they hunted them or gathered them, and they would do some processing before taking them back to their village sites or their campsites. Easier to carry. It makes a lot of sense. Those of you that go hunting or fishing, you oftentimes will fish and you will scale the fish, and you might, take out their innards, and then you'd put them in a cooler because it's easier to do that at that location and then transport them. It's very similar kind of an analogy. Now, TCR might also be a historical resource under CEQA. So because it might be a village site, for example, or a burial site, it could meet the definition of a historical resource under CEQA. That's covered in the cultural resources section of the CEQA document. So you may have a situation where you have one resource that is both a historical resource under CEQA and a tribal cultural resource. That means you have to deal with them in two separate sections of your CEQA document. And I've placed a very generalized description of what a historical resource under CEQA is. It is not actually limited to buildings and structures, like a lot of people think when they hear that word historical resources. It can be a site. The definition is here. But what I want to point out is that in order for it to be significant under CEQA, a historical resource, an archaeological site must meet at least one of these criteria and retain sufficient integrity to convey that significance if it is a historical resource. This is different with tribal cultural resources. The differences include the following. Number one, archaeologists are identifying archaeological sites, but tribal experts identify tribal cultural resources. And a tribal cultural resource is not always archaeological, like I mentioned on the previous slide. Tribal cultural resources can be things like sacred spaces, which typically have no physical markers and are not archaeological. They can be ethnographic trails and trade routes that might only be marked by natural features, which again comes back to that landscape that I talked about earlier. It can be a cultural landscape if it's defined in terms of its size and scope. It can be important habitat where resource gathering or hunting was traditionally carried out. But where this differs from archaeological sites and historical resources is that the sense of integrity, being intact and in place, is not a requirement for TCRs under state law. It is a requirement for historical resources. But again, when you have things that are slightly overlapping, it can get a little bit difficult. But that's why you have experts in archaeology and tribal cultural resources to help you sort that out when you're doing that. Now, as I conclude, I'm getting close to concluding my portion of this presentation. I want to talk a little bit about cultural sensitivity during consultation. And this is something that I have had to develop over many years of doing archaeology. I am not a Native American archaeologist. In other words, my heritage is not Native American. I am an anthropologist, however, and it's important as an anthropologist to be that I maintain that cultural relativism, that I am very aware of cultural differences and different worldviews. And it's a skill that many people take many years to develop. It requires some awareness that tribal governments have very different procedures for making decisions and timelines. There isn't necessarily one decision maker. It's usually a tribal council, or it's a cultural committee that advises the tribal council. And they have, just like city councils and boards of supervisors, they have different meeting schedules as well, because they are a tribal, sovereign, native sovereign government. So they have their own schedules for their governance. So we have to remind ourselves that sometimes those schedules for meetings and their public meetings don't always align with ours. And so that's been a learning curve for a lot of us that work in this industry. We also need to remind ourselves that there's this institutional memory that I call, that the occupation of this area of the entire country by Europeans is still very raw. And it's one thing that I've learned by talking with so many tribal elders and hearing the stories when they were growing up of the challenges and the discrimination and the displacement. It's still there among many, many members of the tribal communities. And I know that Robert will talk a little bit more about that. I've also learned through my years that the tribes and the communities are oftentimes displaced from their traditional lands. Right after Europeans came over and the missions were really developing in California, a lot of tribes were unfortunately just rounded up and they were moved to other locations. For that reason, when any of us send off for a list of culturally affiliated tribes to the Native American Heritage Commission, we will oftentimes get back a list of culturally affiliated individuals that may not be geographically located near the project. And that's because even though right now they are physically living somewhere else, they are still culturally affiliated with that area. I try to kind of liken it to my situation. I'm from Wisconsin. I grew up in Milwaukee. I'm a cheesehead and a Packer fan. And I live in California now. And the fact that I no longer live in Wisconsin does not make me any less affiliated with that state. And it's very similar kind of analogy with many tribes. They may not be physically located near your project, but that doesn't mean they're not culturally affiliated. I've also come to realize that not all tribes have the same amount of resources to be able to consult meaningfully. There are some tribes that have sufficient funding. They have programs and businesses that are able to help sustain their operations, but not all tribes are fortunate enough to have that. And when that happens, it really kind of almost creates another unfunded mandate where there's this mandated tribal consultation process, but you have tribes that don't have the ability to actually travel somewhere to have a meaningful meeting or a site visit. So I try to be flexible in my thinking about how best can we get information to the tribes. Maybe it's different ways. Zoom has really helped a lot in recent years, being able to bring more people together. And another important thing to think about too is that tribes don't all speak with the same voice. And another thing that I've learned is that when I'm consulting or helping an agency consult with tribes, it's important not to have one big tribal consultation meeting with multiple tribes. Every tribe is its own sovereign nation, and they have different opinions and different philosophies and different information. And so that information is very private. So having individual meetings with tribes instead of one large meeting is always good practice. And then lastly, the fact that, and I touched on this earlier, that the main method for transmission of traditional ecological knowledge and tribal histories is through oral history, songs, and ceremonies. Those have to be practiced in order for that information to be transmitted from generation to generation and kept alive. It's like a sourdough starter. If you're going to start sour bread, you're going to have to feed that, and you're going to have to every day, you're going to have to do something to kind of keep that starter alive so that you can bake your bread later. Very, very similar. And even the Governor Newsom has acknowledged this sensitivity and the awareness that there have been a lot of challenges presented to tribes over the years, and even issued an apology to Native Americans for the historical wrongdoings. And then finally, wrapping this all up before the break, I want to say that the whole purpose of CEQA is really, and any kind of environmental review, is to identify a resource and seek ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those impacts in that order. And you can do that in very creative ways in consultation with the tribe when that consultation process happens early at the front end of the project. There's some case law out there that says avoidance is preferred. And so we always start with avoidance as what our real goal is. And because I said earlier, you can't always know where things are, we oftentimes will establish buffers. This is very common in archaeology too, where we look at, well, we kind of know where this resource is, but it probably extends below the surface a little bit. So let's put a buffer of about 100 feet. Why 100 feet? That's a standard number that's commonly used in the industry, because that's usually the radius in which, if you find something during construction, you have to stop and you have to deal with it in accordance with state law. So we usually oftentimes will set that as 100, but sometimes it could be more, sometimes it could be less. It really depends on topography and the types of resources. Other things that can be done, incorporating them into open space. There can be tribal monitoring during ground disturbance. But in the end, though, avoidance might not be feasible. It might be a public safety project. There may just be engineering constraints and building codes. It may just be really difficult. But then the agency needs to take measures to minimize the impacts. And all of this is done in combination or in coordination with the consulting tribes. But sometimes tribal monitoring is appropriate, sometimes capping. Capping is basically laying down soil and a combination of layers of materials to create a vertical separation so that you can have activity going on above, but then that activity is not going to have an effect on what's below. Some types of sites, that's a very appropriate way of minimizing impacts. It's not appropriate for everything like human remains, but it's certainly something that is in your toolbox and available to you. There's also the idea of keeping soil that is disturbed during ground disturbing activities, balancing it on site and not exporting it, because archaeological soil is composed of all sorts of constituents, artifacts, food remains, all sorts of different things that creates what we call like a prehistoric compost. Essentially, it's just organically rich materials filled with artifacts. If you take that off site or you move that, that actually creates another archaeological site. It's for that reason that archaeologists like myself, when we do flint knapping for recreation, where we're making stone tools, practicing that craft, it is important for us to lay down a tarp over which we do our flint working. Because if we were to do it on the ground, then we would be creating a lithic scatter that would just be there forever. And that would not be appropriate because that's not an archaeological site, that's flint working for recreation. So it's a very similar concept. And there's lots of other things that can be done, but the last resort is mitigation and preparing an EIR. We certainly don't want to have to do that, but that it is in that order: avoidance and then minimization and then mitigation if necessary. So I think to sum this up, the best practices that I can recommend just as a practicing archaeologist that I see being done in various other jurisdictions in the state are things like setting up quarterly check-in meetings. The Army Corps of Engineers does this a lot. Caltrans does this in some of their districts. Having those periodic meetings to discuss, project look-ahead reports and just having everybody on the same page is very helpful. Some agencies are establishing designated tribal liaisons. So a certain staff member that will be the single point of contact and the resource that tribes can go to if they are having trouble getting information or have questions. In addition, you should consider having a decision maker in the room. I think in the spirit of government to government consultation, having a tribal representative and an elected official is always good practice. You might want to consider adopting a land acknowledgement statement. A lot of agencies are doing that. Most universities and colleges have land acknowledgements. I gave one at the beginning of this workshop. I think it's always good to have that statement, to always remember, the continuity of human occupation in the area. You might want to consider mandating that cultural resources consultants that are preparing archaeology reports require that they include tribal participation during surveys. Many agencies are doing that now. City of Carlsbad is one such agency that has guidelines I helped develop that now requires that archaeologists involve tribal participation. I think that's always good practice. And then consider training new employees to help take tribal consultation training and help them understand this process. And then consider adopting guidelines to be a tool for staff. And I'm really excited that the city of Clearlake is taking on that process right now. And we have already started that outreach to tribes. So with that, I know that we've been going on for a little over an hour. I think this is a great opportunity to take a quick break and reconvene in about 10 minutes. And then Robert Geary is going to take over and he's going to give the tribe's perspective and provide a lot of really good information about tribal cultural resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will reconvene in 10 minutes at 10:18. There's donuts in there. You missed it. Alan, can you bring everybody in? Yeah. This is not what I wanted. I wanted. Mr. Geary, are you ready, sir? Do you need anything,
I don't think so.
reconfiguration or anything?
No, as long as Ms. Westwood is still on, she can change my slides.
I
See that?
sure am, Robert. Thank you.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, and I think we're good with how the cameras are set up, so people in Zoom world can see you.
So is it okay? I think because I also want to speak to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
No,
pick it
absolutely.
up
This is,
and round.
this is a different style meeting than
Okay,
what we're used
cool.
to.
I'm a mover, so.
Yes, you are. All right.
Okay,
We are reconvened. I'd like to thank Mr. Gary for our next presentation coming up. Mr. Gary, the floor is yours.
thank you. First, I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this training today and this workshop today. I think it's really important to get the tribal perspective. I think when we're in the process of making determinations, I think for projects and permits, especially with some of the guidelines, I think that are upon us today, a really important part. So I just want to introduce myself in my language really quick. Something that's.
Sorry, Robert.
Hekate mai okate kemtsel wichen Robert Gary Yahake Limbak Habematol tip Yahake Koi tip Tawal Kit. How are all of you today? My name is Robert Gary. I work for Habematol and for Koi. Today I'm in the capacity of the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer in this training today, giving my portion of this workshop and the tribal perspective. I think when dealing with CEQA and AB 52 and tribal consultation. So I just wanted to kind of go down the some of my qualifications, I think, for my position and some of the expertise that I have, I think, with the job and the position that I fall under. So I am the administrator of cultural resources and also the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Habematol Pomo of Upper Lake. I'm also the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer designee on behalf of the Koi Nation. I'm also a cultural leader and practitioner of the Willamette Colony where I'm from, where I live. I'm also a Southeastern Pomo language teacher and learner still. And I live on the reservation of Willamette. I'm a member of the California Tribal Historic Preservation Officers organization and also a member of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. I also sit on the Lake County Cannabis Ordinance Task Force Committee with the county for permitting cannabis projects. I'm also one of the recipients of the from the California Tribal Historic Preservation Officers of the 2021 Cultural Resource Management of the Year Award from the Society for California Archaeology. I'm also a cultural curation advisor and artist to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, did the Young Museum for the Jules Tavernier and the Clearlake Pomo exhibition, along with exhibitions with the Grace Hudson Museum, and also working with the San Francisco Opera. I've conducted many interviews with NBC, News for Native California, San Jose Mercury News, LA Times, News for Native News Online, Capital News Radio. I've also done presentations and training for the State Department of Water Resources, the Lake County Office of Education, the Lake County Planning Commissioners and Planners, The PL 280 training provided by Habematol Pomo of Upper Lake for the Lake County Sheriff's Office. Also presented at the judges breakfast on tribal cultural resources, training for Department of Transportation, Society for California Archaeology. I've also done cultural awareness trainings for UC Berkeley, Stanford, UC Davis, and Purdue. So as you can see, I kind of have a wider array of a lot of different hats that I wear, both in my professional capacity and also in my personal capacity. And so culture has been a part of my life from day one, and still practicing today. Not only that, but just making sure that that knowledge that I've learned from my elders is actually being passed down, not only to my family but my community and now to the cities and counties that I work in. Next slide, please. So I just want to start off, I think, with, this make big. I just want to start off with kind of where we're at today. And one of the problems I think that, we really need to see what Lake County has happened, what has happened to the tribal communities, I think, within Lake County in the history that's here. So as you can see on the slide, to the right is the actual mercury mine. This is a picture that was in the 1930s. This is a picture of the Bradley mine. You can see Konocti in the background. In the very middle, it's a little tiny speck, but that's an actual excavator. So it kind of gives you the range of the destruction that was there. So in my territory, from where I'm from, this was an actual land track. And so this was prior to AB 52, 106, any kind of environmental laws. So a lot of the tribal cultural resources that were there were destroyed and are no longer there. On the left-hand side, historically, archaeological collections that happened prior to a lot of the laws that are set into place here. In 1906, you can see Grace Nicholson, which, she has a lot of collections, especially in the Lake County Museum, was a big part of Lake County in collecting items. The unfortunate thing is how she collected. In this picture, she had a Pomo resident actually excavate the remains of his uncle and items that were also in that. And this is just the history. So I'm not here to make anybody feel bad. I'm just showing the picture of historically, this is kind of how the tribe's resources were either extracted or destroyed. And this is all prior to the laws that were set in place. And we're dealing with some of these things today. So firsthand account of bad practices, I think that were, prior to a lot of the environmental laws that have been set in place. And I think due to this is exactly why some of those laws were enacted and brought to light. So, and these are, like I said, these are actual photos. The Grace Nicholson is actually at the Huntington Library down in Southern California. And the caption isn't anything that I made up. The caption is actually the caption that went with the photo. So it's, like I said, it's just a reminder of some of the tribal perspectives when we're talking about our history and our culture, that this is what we're affected by. And so we're trying to save and trying to either repatriate some of those items that were, a part of this legacy that's happened. So next slide, please. So I'm going to give a little history about tribal history about the city of Clearlake or Lake County itself. So the actual name from the Pomo tribes that are around here is called Qabatin. The word Qabatin means big water. The word Kha is water, Batin means big. And so regardless of whether you're Southeastern Pomo or you're Eastern Pomo, it's still the same. I'm almost certain that Lake Miwok probably has a different name for it. But with that said, today there are 7 tribes that are within Lake County. 7 different nations different processes, different protocols, different traditions that are part of Lake County. Lake County, or Clear Lake, is actually the oldest lake in North America, in our country. The Pomo word actually was not anything that we called ourselves. It was actually created by an anthropologist that came into the area and kind of started studying us and started saying, okay, well, your languages are somewhat familiar or similar. And so I'm going to call you all Pomo. And so the actual word in my language, when it's broken down, the word po, which in a lot of communities, Pomo communities, is the actual name for the magnesite, and which is held highly as far as currency. Magnesite is they also refer to as Pomo gold. And mo is the actual hole or cave where it was extracted from to make these beads. And so hence Pomo. That's where it came from. Where you come from, where I'm from, over in Alem, we're called Umtimfo. That's a native person, native people. Umtiwi is a native man. From where my mom's from in Eastern Pomo, Galkus would be a native person or a native man. So those things are the distinctions, I think, between what is, the tribal perspective. I think when we're looking at history, even back to the name of like what we're calling ourselves. So the word Kanaktai, which is something that we see every day, have a picture of it up in here, is actually a Southeastern Pomo word. It's not an Eastern Pomo word, but it's a Southeastern Pomo word. The word Kano actually means mountain, and Kutai actually means more than one woman, older woman, plural. So it actually means the old mountain women. And so that is actually a name that is, like I said, in the Southeastern Pomo language. To go over from where my mom's from, and she's from Big Valley, and she's Eastern Pomo. They call the mountain Kanobatin, and the reason why is the perspective changes. When you're looking at it from my mom's place, one hill or point or ridge hides behind the other, and it only looks like one big mountain. So Denobatin just means big mountain. And so that's the uniqueness, I think, that we have from within our communities, our different communities. And so one of the things that some of that significance and in cultural knowledge, I think that comes with consultation of better understanding, the landscape from a cultural perspective. First contact in Lake County was 1833. And the Pomo were affected by loss of land, disease, slavery, mining, missions, not able to practice ceremonies, language, and a government-sanctioned genocide. This is exactly just what it is and what had happened. So as far as coming from the tribal community or tribal perspective, we're looking at ways of being able to incorporate, the indigenous community that's from here. And the way to do that is to understand, I think, the history, the true history. It's not a pretty one. It's an ugly one. But through all of that, the fact is, through all of that, we're still here. Pomo communities are still here. The traditional and cultural practices are still being done. The traditional and cultural knowledge is still being passed. So that's happening today. Next slide, please. So the Habemeto Pomo of Upper Lake and the Koi Nation Cultural Resources Departments, that's the department that I work for. And so these are some of the things I think that we, as far as, when getting into consultation, what our department is actually doing before we actually get to consultation and what we're tasked with. So the main thing is the protection and preservation of tribal cultural resources. That's what our job is. That's what we're tasked with. And to do that, we have to stay current on federal and state environmental laws, requirements for the protection of tribal cultural resources through NEPA, CEQA, 106, AB 52, SB 18, NAGPRA, AB 275, and also AB 168, which Lisa hit on earlier. So through this, now for the protection and preservation of the tribe's historical footprint on the land, we have an opportunity to be able to bring our expertise now to the consultation table to make a good determination for projects that are going to either get approved or permitted, to be able to make sure that we can save that footprint. So as you can see, some of these things that, that we are doing on a day-to-day basis, like, we reviewed the recent guidance document from the Advisory Council on the Historic Preservation in the White House. We consult with federal, state, and local agencies about impacts on cultural resources for permitted projects. We mitigate the process. The high, as far as for our threshold, the main thing is to mitigate a project for preservation in place. And that's really, especially, I think, with a lot of the development that not only the city of Clearlake wants to do, but also the county. And so that's where the tribe has the distinct opportunity, I think, to sit down in consultation and figure out a way that both the city and the counties can do the development actions that they need to, also with the preservation and protection of the tribe's cultural resource. And I think Lisa hit on it earlier, is that the earlier, the better. The redesign of something, a project that can particularly happen on a certain project that is culturally sensitive, is definitely something that is cost effective and easy to do at the very beginning. Before we get down the line and something happens and something pops up where now it's stopped. Now we have to figure out an idea or a way or a process on how are we going to deal with this. And so those are some of the things I think that it streamlines, I think, when we're there often and early. So we also collect research and archival material on the tribe's history in their Aboriginal territories. So it's not only the tribal perspective when we come to consultation tables, but all of those, our past ancestors and our family members that were actually interviewed and documented, from past anthropologists and archaeologists that we go through. And what did they leave? What kind of recordings, along with the cultural and the traditional community, of the Pomo people that are within the area, talking with them too about any concerns or anything that they know about. And we compile all that into one and get ourselves prepared for consultation. So like I said, we actually record data. There's, recordings of, past tribal members, we're talking about sensitive areas, talking about how they might have, went to seasonal camps, talking about like how they processed. So all of this information is very, very, very important information to us, because when we're looking at a project that might be big in scope and we're finding multiple areas, we know why, whether or not it was, seasonal, whether, it was an actual village, whether or not how they actually utilized actually the landscape. So it's very important that we go through all of this important information, important data, archives that were left behind, and then even with the current tribal members and knowledge keepers that we talk to and that we discuss with. We also create maps of culturally sensitive areas. This is something that I think Lisa alluded to earlier, is that not all tribes have the same capacity to be able to deal with tribal cultural resources. I'm fortunate enough to be able to work for Habemetal Pomo of Upper Lake, and we have those resources. I'm able to come to the consultation table with an actual map. I'm due to the confidentiality agreement that we've done with the Chris Center down at Sonoma State. I can show that, but I literally can't give it out. Those are things that also, that information is also in your environmental assessment from archaeologists. I think when you have a survey done, that definitely should be there. There's a lot of times I think that when my department comes to the consultation table, that I have a little bit more, because I'm incorporating not only the traditional knowledge and the cultural knowledge from the tribe, I'm incorporating with the scientific knowledge. And so it's, not putting down or saying that any less than what the archaeologists are doing, but I think coming from the tribal perspective on tribal cultural resources, we bring a little more detail to the consultation. We also actually go out and do land surveys. So what we do is we go out there once we get notified, and we'll hear about a project and we know that it's sensitive. Say there's a waterway on both sides of it. There's some kind of indicator that stands out to us, that we want to go out there before anything happens and go out and see if we can see anything on top. Take a look and to see if there's, some kind of survey that we noticed from an indicator that we see on a map to double check, triple check, and make sure that we're walking through that and in surveying the area for anything that could be exposed before any kind of machine gets actually put on the actual project site. We also train and prepare tribal monitors for each project. So through our training, we have to, over at Habemetal, we make sure that our monitors, and even through COI, is that they have to have OSHA, they have to be safe. To be able to be on a project site, we want them to be able to work all day and then come back to their families at night. Safety is key. HAZWOPER, when we're, talking about the mercury mine cleanup that's happening, Superfund site that's happening, you can only be on there with the HAZWOPER certification. Habemetal Pomo has actually had monitors out on site for the fire. You had to have HAZWOPER certs. So we are also making sure and mandating that our tribal monitors are certified to be on these, not only with just the traditional and the cultural knowledge that the tribe has, but also to make sure that they actually have the safety certifications and knowledge that they need to be on, specialized sites. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So one thing that Lisa hit on earlier today, and what is really important, is tribal cultural knowledge, the importance of tribal cultural knowledge. And I think this is one of the issues that we really want to push and make sure that, and I've said it in a few other meetings, that tribal cultural knowledge is knowledge that is, passed down from generation to generation, that is not in these surveys. There's conversations that I've had with, archaeologists about certain aspects that, their perspective of when they do a survey. And when I bring in some of that cultural knowledge, it starts to kind of click and it makes a better detailed picture. And so that's why it's important to make sure that tribal cultural knowledge is a part of this process. Under CEQA, the substantial evidence includes fact, a reasonable assumption predicated upon fact, or expert opinion supported by fact. So areas of where my families have gone to gather, areas that we've gone and hunted, these are things that I know a lot of times when we're bringing that information to the consultation table, we're looked at as that's in the history, like that isn't anything. We still do those things today. I still go to those places and pick medicine. I still go to those places and hunt. I still do things that my ancestors have done in the same places. I go to the same places where my grandfather's taken me. Even when we make our pilgrimages all the way out to the coast, as our ancestors did, I actually go to the same place that my grandparents stayed at. My kids, now my grandkids, are staying in that same place when we go down and we gather from the ocean. We still do that today. So under AB 52 for tribal cultural knowledge, it says California Native American tribe, traditionally and culturally affiliated with a geographic area, may have expertise concerning their tribal cultural resources. The legislature found that and declared that because CEQA calls for a sufficient degree of analysis, tribal cultural knowledge about the land and tribal cultural resources at issue should be included in environmental assessment for the projects that may be a significant impact, that may have significant impacts on those resources. And that's what I do. That's what my job is. My job is when the consultation happens, the tribal cultural resources and the tribal knowledge that doesn't come from, the archaeologist or anyone else that's at the consultation table, that's comes from me. And for that makes us have a better and more detailed picture about potential impacts for tribal cultural resources, and to be able to continue the consultation for the project to be complete. And I think that's really what tribes are doing when they're trying to figure out or trying to understand how we can preserve in place, if possible, if not through other mitigation measures, how we can continue to make sure that the project goes forward, but still protect what we have in place. And so that's the process for consultation. This is considerations. This is archaeological information is not the same or substituted for tribal cultural knowledge from culturally affiliated tribes. And I think this is one of the things that the tribes are starting to really push, especially at the tribal. It's not that we're saying to discount the archaeological surveys. We're also asking to include the tribe's expertise in what the survey has found. And then also include preservation methods that we can all come together and agree upon in making sure that we don't lose that footprint. And so it's really important to understand the differences between archaeological resources and tribal cultural resources. A lot of times I look, when I look at mitigation measures, and I see how they mitigate, whether it's the city or the county. And like I said, I've done this not only here in Lake County, but I've done it in 5 other counties prior to moving back here. So I've seen where the mitigation measures for archaeological resources are basically just cut and pasted on tribal cultural resources. And they're two different. They're two different type of resources. So they have to be mitigated in 2 different ways. And that's goes to consultation with the tribe, understanding their protocols and traditional cultural practices, their values, and incorporating that into any inadvertent discoveries that are going to happen. How are they going to deal with it? If it's burials, how are they going to deal with it? The way that, my tribe would deal with a burial is different from, the different to, Middletown, on how Middletown Rancheria would deal with it, to Big Valley. And that's what makes us unique, is that we're all our own sovereign nation, our own processes, our own protocols, our own traditions. And that's what has to be brought to the table. It's not a checkbox and saying, okay, well, hey, I talked to one and they're all going to go with this, because it doesn't work that way. And so it's important, especially when you have, and to be prepared, because there's probably going to be projects that are in shared territories. It doesn't mean that one tribe is over the other. It doesn't mean that one tribe is right and one tribe is wrong. It means that now you have to take into consideration possibly 2 mitigation measures to be able to incorporate both tribes and what either the city or the county wants. So, and in the end, it's really making sure that mitigation measures are there and set in place that everyone feels comfortable with. I know on behalf of the Koi Nation, since I've been coming to these meetings, the tribe is not against development. We've sat down and we've discussed how can we make development continue with making sure that we still can save. And Lisa, talked about it earlier, was talking about monitoring. That's one mitigation. And so preservation in place, we're talking about engineered fill, we're talking about, looking at, different types of fabric setting on top. It's a lot of different types, redesigns, different types of ways to mitigate. Next slide. So we talked about tribal cultural resources earlier. And I think, when you see the definition and you get an idea of what you think tribal cultural resources are, everybody sees something different. Everyone looks at something different. And we got to remember that tribal cultural resources are what is significant to the tribe. And under those laws and under, what it gives you, it's actually, put into 4 different categories when we look at it. So if you sit here and you take a look, so 1 is Native American human remains and grave related artifacts, burial associated items. So it says different types of burials. And, I want to hit on this after I get done reading this. Different types of burials may occur in one area inhabited by the same tribe, especially if it was inhabited over an extended period of time. There's no way to generalize about the burial practices of California Native Americans. The possibility of discovering remains and methods for preventing or minimizing disturbance for burials must be evaluated individually for each project. And the reason why this is really important to know, because not to generalize, I think, burial practices, not to think because of how we look at cemeteries and burial grounds today is like everyone had that set in place, and it wasn't. Historically, I know with the tribes that are here, prior to contact, it was cremation. Our families cremated. And I should say, I'm only speaking on behalf of where I'm from, because I know that's what we did. And that's from over in Atlanta. After contact, because of a lot of the changes that were happening with the new settlers that were coming in, there were new religions, new practices, everything. So, and then also like I said, this is just the truth, but government sanctioned genocide, right? So there were bounties put on for Native peoples. And if you came literally with, body parts or showed that you actually, had from, Native Americans, you'd actually get paid from the government for that. And so it changed, because now, not only because of the diseases, and we were getting like high numbers of people dying at the same time, it would have been a big, huge pyre. Now we had to even be concerned that the pyre would give an indication of where our location was. So we had to stop. Not only that, the new religion that was brought in was like, you didn't do that. We have to go through the same thing that the missions and the churches are teaching us that we had to do. So this is the reason why that it can't be generalized, because of the changes that had happened historically to our people, to our community, and to our practices. So we might be able to see, like I said, an intact burial. You might be looking at a partial, where it's partially cremated. We might see a full cremation. So there's no way to generalize exactly like what we should be looking for out there. So just keeping that in mind. And that's category 1. Next slide. Category 2 is traditional cultural sites, such as, and so this is kind of defines it, such as villages, campsites, gathering and harvesting areas, quarries, tool manufacturing areas, rock paintings, carving areas, and burial grounds. So all of these fall under traditional cultural sites. All of those things fall into those sites. So areas that have cultural significance to the tribe are cultural sites. And so this is why it's important, because down in the southeastern Pomo, when I brought this up, is that there was a uniqueness to a system that was set up down here. And so I'll get into that a little bit more. But these areas are still around today. These areas are still being utilized today. And so take that into account, that not just because we're looking at, and we call them tribal cultural resources, and when we think of archaeological resources, we always think of everything that was done in the past, like they're not being utilized today, and they are. I know that because I do it. I know it because there's areas that I normally would go as a child, and now somebody owns it or someone else owns it. And so I had to literally go up and ask for permission. Hey, can I still come up here and harvest? I tell them the whole history. I get yeahs and I get no's. But that's just how it is. Next page. 3, religious and spiritual sites. So traditional locations for events or sites that with spiritual significance. A dance ground, a place for gathering traditional medicines, or a place for an Indian doctor or shamans to gather strength is a spiritual site. This can be a prominent peak, rock formation, or a cave. And all of these places that are here, that are listed under religious or spiritual sites, are here in Lake County. They still exist. They're still here. And it's scary, I think, for me, because a lot of those places are not in any of these surveys or these archaeological reports. A lot of that information is passed down from generation to generation because either somebody in one of our families was a medicine person, or someone was, passing down that information to go to a certain family for when certain things happen. So that it's there. It's there. These things are here. I show a picture of Mount Konocti, and for all of us, that's a sacred place. For all 7 tribes here in Lake County, it's a sacred place. It's in all of our creation stories, sacred. And the reason why I bring up sacred and to understand the word sacred, I guess I want to make a comparison to the Liberty Bell, right? So this comes from our stories of creation, the beginning of time. So we have the Liberty Bell that is, I think it's 270 years old. It has its own building. It has a guard. You can't touch it. And you actually have to go through like this metal detector because of how sacred it is. And I guess with that picture, that mentality is exactly what the tribal communities are saying these places are for us. These items are for us. That sanctity and that sacredness that Liberty Bell holds, it's a cracked bell, doesn't even work anymore. But it holds significance, right, to this country. And the tribes that are here are all countries. They're all their own nations. And their tribal cultural resources are the Liberty Bell. The significance of the Liberty Bell. And that's, I think, what we're trying to understand. We're trying to get. Next page. So number 4 are artifacts, cultural remains left by past peoples. And so here we're looking at now, the combination of both archaeological and tribal, right? Because artifacts are cultural items left by past peoples. Artifacts often found in California may be modified fish, animal bone, stones, wood. Like these are the things, and we all know about it, right? I mean, and these are items that are of Lake County. And just what we were hearing earlier is when you pick up these items, even for an archaeologist, now that indicator that there might be something behind there is gone. And as a tribal cultural resource administrator and going into consultations and a TIPO, I hear when I go onto project sites, and I hear when I go into consultations or when I'm talking to anybody from, that are the operators, we used to find hundreds of these. And I hear it all the time. And so hundreds of indicators are gone. And so when that archaeologist actually swoops through and that indicator is gone, and they don't do testing below the ground, we'll never know. And not only that, when those make it, whether they're to someone's house, they're being passed down from generation to generation in somebody else's, backyard, we lose that. We lose that. So, like I said, this is definitely something that falls under both. This is definitely something that the archaeologist is actually out there looking at. From this, they can actually find out information. They can tell you by the type of arrowhead that it's there, how old it is. Just by the style, what was used. So we just got to remember that, right? I mean, we're looking at a national average anywhere from 10 to 13,000 years. I think because it actually went up, that they're saying that there was inhabitants here in North America. But we still keep forgetting about surveys that are not looked at or discussed for an arrow point for the cleanup over in Superfund site that was found, that was dated over 20,000. So what the tribe has been saying consistently is that we've been here longer than that. And it's starting to come to fruition, but we're just waiting for all the archaeologists, I guess, to get the scientific to prove what we've been saying all along. So it's important to know that, right? It's important to know these different categories that fall into this and what those are. It's easy when you look at it as a whole to say, okay, well, this is what TCRs are. But when you look at it as, okay, what are artifacts? Okay, these are artifacts, right? You know, what are burials? Burials, we just assume that, okay, well, hey, it's just, you know, the remains. No, it's also the burial associated items that go along with that. The things that the families actually put to make sure that when this body travels or the spirit travels, that it has what it's supposed to have. And it's important for that to be with it in order to make that completion. And so it's significant. The bad part about it is that there's a term called bioturbation. So that's basically any kind of rodent or anything that's underneath the ground that might go and maybe get an item and take it back to its burrow, and you'll see items. And then, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the burial and the burial associated items are all in different locations. But the tribe with the tribal expertise can actually come back in, take a look at the burial and kind of, oh, well, that goes with that. That would normally happen. And that's the reasoning for tribal expertise. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to reiterate the last 4 categories. Those were tribal cultural resources. Those were things listed as what are tribal cultural resources. So when you see those things, and we're actually at the consultation table, this is the reason why. When we're talking about landscapes, we're talking about tracks, we're talking about gathering areas, we're talking about fishing areas. This is what we're talking about. So we, as far as cultural resource department, like I said, I'm lucky enough to work for a really good tribe that actually takes tribal cultural resources seriously and gives me the tools to be able to do what I need to do. Mapping, you know, knowledgeable people to do, you know, surveys. So some of the things that we do is meaningful consultation and mitigation for potential impacts. So we sit down and we try to talk with whatever agency that we're consulting with and addressing our concerns. And hopefully through that consultation, we can come up with a good idea, depending on what the tribe wants to do and how they want to go forward, is really what I'm acting on. You know, how can we make this happen together? Tribal monitoring on project ground disturbance to lower impacts is just a mitigation measure, one mitigation measure. Something to ensure not only the things that maybe the archaeologists have found significant, but also to protect the things that the tribe finds significant. And I think we heard those earlier, the importance of both of those. Mapping sensitive areas. Like I said, I'm fortunate enough to be able to have a GIS, to be able to take everything from the beginning of time, right, to current, on things that have been found archaeologically. And, you know, like we heard earlier, we can't necessarily pinpoint exactly where that is, but there's a poly that they give you and kind of say, okay, well, this is kind of the extent of it. And this is where we find items here, there. So we're going to give you a generalized area. So we're fortunate enough to be able to get that data. Now the tribes can obtain that data from the CRIS Center. If they have a GIS, it's like we do, we incorporate that into our mapping system. And we're able to provide that right here at the consultation or at any consultation that we're at. And it might be information that, you know, the agency already has. A lot of times it's not. A lot of times it's the things that they're seeing for the first time. And under our confidentiality agreement that we have with the CRIS Center, like I said, I can share it and I can show it, but I can't give it. That's the agreement with the CRIS Center. Sonoma State. We also do, like I said, you know, we do site surveys for projects and try to get out, especially if we see an area that we know is really sensitive. We want to make sure that there's nothing on top. Well, I'll literally say, hey, can I go out and do a survey? Can I go out and do a site survey? See if there's anything laying up on top. To better make a better determination when I get back and we can reconvene back into consultation, how we're going to deal with that. If there's things that are laying up on top, what are we going to do to do that? What are we going to do to make that process better? To be able to move those things, to be able to bring in fill, whatever the mitigation is. But at least there's a discussion about a plan. We also cultural sensitivity training for project personnel. This is one aspect that we bring to be proactive about making sure that not only the conversations that we're having at the consultation, but also with project personnel, the main people that we really want to see get educated and involved are the ones that are working the big operator, the big machines. That's who we want to talk to. Because most of the time when they're dealing with excavators, they got this arm that's in front of them and they're swiping all over the place. They can't see anything. And if there's no one that's on site to be able to tell them to stop, they can go through burials, they can go through important data, not only just burials that are important or items that are important to the tribe, but important data to an archaeologist to tell about or to talk about information that has happened in the past that can help us today. With drought, all these things that have happened prior. It's all in there. And we also collaborate with the site archaeologist. We always tell our monitors, make them be your friend, because they're looking at it from one aspect, the scientific aspect, and you're bringing the cultural aspect to it. And together, they can do a better job. Together, they can make better determinations. Together, the job will continue to do what it needs to do, and everything can be protected. And I think that's the biggest thing. Our monitors, even though we teach them about some stuff archaeologically, I'm always telling them when they're out there with an archaeologist, pick his brain, pick her brain. Get any information that you can that's going to help you up your game to understand the scientific part of it. We're doing everything that we can. We get all the scientific data. We're using, mapping systems now. We're consulting. We want to be able to up our game and understand that other perspective. But in the same sense, we're asking for the same. We're asking to understand our perspective. So, and then we also work with developers. If there's a project that we see that's in a sensitive area, or there's a sensitive area that's, in a project site, if we can get a project to be redesigned where that site is going to be intact and stay intact and go into another area, or put maybe, the structure that was going to be right on top of it that was going to affect it, that helps everything. For the fact that now an archaeologist, the job doesn't get stopped. The archaeologist has to come out. The engineers have to come out and figure out a redesign. So it's costly, time consuming. When the tribe is there at the very beginning and these things are brought to light, it streamlines the process. It saves money. And so that's why, it is very important to make sure that tribal cultural resources are consulted with the tribe, and mitigation measures are agreed upon. So there are no glitches when that happens in the process. Next picture, please, or next slide. So it's important to know what a tribal cultural monitor does. For us, our Habemetal monitors and our Koi monitors, we have a pretty high threshold. There's reports that are due every day. It's not just sitting out there and watching. It's not just, it's literally, consistently, working and doing something. And then also making sure that you make it home by the end of the day. As you can see, our tribal monitor, he's right here in front of a scraper right here, right? So our tribal monitors, a tribal cultural monitor's job is to protect and preserve the tribe's cultural and historic resources on a project site. And the reason why I say historic is for the fact that we got to keep in mind also Indian or tribal land ownership prior to all of these things. So we've actually had tribal members who actually had owned land. And those areas where they either had old houses and those kind of things, those are still important to us, especially, if it's a family from a community they work for. And if we find pieces of their house, or we find something that all of that traditionally in a cultural protocols for it is, we want all of that to be able to either put it back into the place where it came from, or to be able to make sure that we can put it into a place where it's not going to be disturbed anymore. their newer house, right? So we look at all of it. It's an important part of our process. Tribal cultural monitor also identifies tribal cultural resources and reduces the impacts to construction activities. And like I said, it's not an automatic that we go to. It depends from project to project. What's happening? How sensitive is the area? Like I said, there's projects where, we just spot check. We'll stop in and just to kind of see how things are going. There's projects where, all we do is do a cultural sensitivity training, but it'll go from project to project depending on the sensitivity of the area and what's going on there. And all that determination is made from the scientific and archaeological reports that we get, the cultural data that we have, and everything that we look at to research to see how sensitive the area is. The tribal monitor also works with various agencies to provide insight into cultural sites, treatments, dispositions of artifacts, or any other culturally affiliated items. So when something is happening out there on a project site, our monitor is making sure that, it's not being desecrated, that people aren't, and I've seen this. We're actually on project sites where I've seen people actually take human remains and they put it in the bucket and they were taking pictures of it. And it's because there was no one there to tell them not to do that, even though no one should have to tell you not to do that, right? But these are the practices that were being done. And that's the importance of the tribe, is to make sure that those, whether it's burials, or we're looking at items or artifacts or burial associated items, that they're treated with respect. And if there's no one that's out there, and we all know construction, and I'm not trying to put the construction companies down, but a lot of it is timeline. If I can get my project done in a matter of time or faster, then there might be an incentive. I might go on to another job. Who knows? We work side by side with the archaeologists to ensure that tribal cultural resources are being treated with appropriate respect and dignity. That's one of the things that is really important, I think, to us in making sure, is to make sure that those items are treated with respect. To ensure the tribe's processes and protocols are being followed by all project personnel. So this is really important to know, because protocols and processes are being discussed and talked about in the consultation. Now, who's going to enforce that out on the actual project site? If no one from the consultation table is actually out on a project site making sure, and they're not out there for a full 8 hours, who knows what's happening? And so when it comes to tribal cultural resources, those resources are important to the tribe. Those resources and those processes that were discussed in consultation are important to the tribe. Next slide, please. So talked about some of the new technology that we're using, right? Like I said, we're trying to blend in, right? We're trying to blend in the new technology with the cultural knowledge. That's what we're trying to do. And so here, the county has basically, did their review of using, scanning the whole county already, using a certain type of software. And so it's things like this that we use to be able to see, okay, well, hey, there's a village site that's out there. So we go and we say, okay, well, we see that the depressions, perfect round depressions don't happen naturally. We see waterways. Then we use this other format to be able to look at and kind of go, okay, well, hey, we have something here. And if no one sees that or it isn't discussed in consultation, then how do the agency or anybody that we're consulting with understand the importance of what's there, especially if we have that connection to that place, if that's in our geographical area. So these are things that are happening within tribal communities. They're starting to get more advanced. They're starting to use technology. And like I said, I happen to be blessed to work with the tribe that is definitely proactive in protecting cultural resources. So what he does, or what our GIS analyst does, is he creates maps for consultation for project surveys before we get out there. If we know it's a sensitive area, we'll be able to actually create us a map showing all the stuff that's already been found out there. And how much do we need to know about like what's laying up on top out there for our surveys? So he makes maps for that. For actual project sites, when we get the information for projects, we'll do an overlay of the APE or APN, and we'll see what's actually within that project site, if there's anything that lies within it or near it. So that's what he does also. He can show us parcels. Tribal monitors, our tribal monitors will go out on project sites and make sure that they know where everything's that's out there, either that's been found in the survey or that's been found in any archaeological report prior to what's been going on. And then if it's a project that we've been on before, we'll actually put in our maps what we've found out on project sites. So our monitors will know exactly the extent of the sensitivity of an actual APE. And so that's what I was talking about right there at the end, where they're talking about tribal cultural resources discovery locations. So when we're on projects, like I said, and we find something, it's actually put into the system. It's put into the system and it's part of that. And then at the end, we'll actually confer with the archaeologist and making sure that all of that information is put in his report that's going to be sent down to the information center. And so now it's recorded. It's a part of the official record. So if anybody or any archaeologist goes later on down the line to go and have some kind of study done, it's going to pop up. So we work collaboratively to make sure that that DPR actually gets put into the record. So one of the things I wanted to show you real quick, and I've showed you this before, I think in consultation, is so this is what Lake County looks like. And every symbol that's on there is an actual archaeological site within Lake County. And it looks like Lake County has chicken pox due to the sensitivity of it. And it's just what it is. Just like everybody who comes to Lake County and sees the majestic mountain and the beautiful lake and kind of go, this is where I want to live. At the beginning of the time, that's exactly the way we looked at it. Like, man, look at all the acorn trees right here with the streams loaded with hitch. It just was a place that provided a lot. And so it's that footprint that we look at when we make our determinations. And so this is not, that map is not in because of the confidentiality, but I'm also having Dino kind of show, because it's important to see really the sensitivity of our county. It's important to know, the tribal perspective and what's being there. And like I said, the important thing to understand is that when you look at that map is only 5% of the registered sites that have been downloaded and put into this. 5%. So it's missing 95% of what's actually in the database. So with that in mind, that's what our GIS guy does. That's why we're able to have and to make a good determination on whether, what kind of mitigation we need to bring to the table to protect what's there. And to share that with the city or the county or whoever agency that we're dealing with or consulting with. That way we can provide that to them as well. None of those marks that were on this map are anything that's generated from the tribe. Like I can't go in there and say, okay, into the CRIS Center and go, I'm going to click this one, put one here. All of that is only through the CRIS Center. And the only other people who have access to get those records are the archaeologists. And it wasn't until a regulation happened in 2019 with the CRIS Center where they approved for the tribes to be able to have that information, because those resources are our resources. And because of the passing of AB 52 and SB 18 and all these other laws that have to do with tribal cultural resources. It gives us a better opportunity to look at how sensitive an area is without trying to make really, like we were talking earlier, if none of the indicators are there, how do we know like what's there? At least this gives us a little bit of a jump start to understand the sensitivity of an actual area, APE, APN site. And we can better consult about how, or the things that we need to be concerned about. Okay, next. So it says, new TCRs are still being discovered today, and they are. We've heard and seen in a lot of the reports and some of the testimony that we've listened to from archaeologists along the way, finding new sites today, new significant sites today. And so we're not done. And that, I think, is an indicator of showing just the sensitivity of the actual area. We're still finding historical, which is important to, not as important to the tribal communities as TCRs are, but historical information, scientific information, data that's in either these layers or in the things that are found in these sites that can help us with some of the pandemics and some of the things that are happening with our world today. And that's how they make determination on how do we prepare for this. Archaeologists will tell you that. That's their job, to look into it and seeing what's happened in the past. When did it happen in the past? How did they deal with what happened in the past? That's what that holds for them. And they're still here today. We're still finding them. So I just wanted to kind of share also. So you've seen the city, not just the city, but the county and how sensitive it is. And so sometimes I feel like when I come to consultation, I'm only talking about Lake County. I'm only saying that Lake County is sensitive. But it's just California in general. So this is 3 counties and the sensitivity of it. Lake County looks like the surrounding counties. And it's just what it is. And these are the reasons why. And I think because it's so inundated with historic resources, tribal cultural resources, and it holds important information, that it is just what it is. And that's the reason why these laws were put in place. That's the reason why tribes are now at the consultation table. That's the reason why, we're making sure that we can actually not stop progress, but also to protect and preserve the tribe's history. So like I said, new TCRs, new tribal cultural resources are still being discovered today. Through what? Development, new development that happens. What do we need? We need an archaeological survey or report. What happens? They find new stuff. Boom, there's something that's new, right? Lower water levels, especially in the last, how many years did we have this drought? I literally was going down by my house, and I live on the reservation, so I know there's TCRs there. But the water level now is going lower, and it was exposing things that I never thought were at those levels. We're at that deep. And so what happens when water levels go down? You kind of get people coming along the shore. They're, picking up arrowheads and seeing all of these things that to them are majestic and, important to them to have like an arrowhead. So that's happening. More tribal involvement, right? Now the tribes have the ability to be at the consultation table to bring this tribal or cultural knowledge there, going, well, hey, there's this site that's there. How can we preserve this site? So just note, all parts of California is used for living, traveling, gathering, religious, and cultural purposes. Before the new settlers, we had trade routes that literally went throughout the state of California. They have found borax obsidian, I think in the Midwest. That's how far it traded. Like I said, we still do pilgrimages. I do it with my family to go, and get traditional foods out at the coast. We still do those things today. And so with all that said, it's important to know that those practices are not gone. They're still being done. But we know what that means when we find something that's literally not from our area, and we know how it got there or how we utilize the land. Next slide, please. This is something that's very important. So this actually comes out of, and it's cited a lot in some of the reports, I think, that the city gets. It just hasn't been mapped. And so the information that it provides in this document by Gifford in 1923. So what's unique about the southern part of the lake and about the southeastern Pomo, which is Ilem, which is over in the Oaks, Koi, which is down here in Lower Lake, and Komdot, which is at Buckingham Island. All southeastern Pomo tribes. But because they were living on islands, what happened, or the system that only the southeastern Pomo have, is that they actually have land tracts that were lineal with families that went on from the shoreline in. And a lot of the native people that you hear that are here today are from those same lines that are from those tracks. And so when we're talking about sacred sites in one of the categories, like I said, southeastern Pomo, this information was documented in a report. This information takes this and shows it as a visual of that this system was alive and well, and it still is. There's areas where we still gather. Like I said, I go gather at places where my grandfather took me. This information was passed down from our relatives to Gifford in 23. And this is what the southern part of the lake looks like because of the tribes were on islands. So if you look at Koi, you see all the Koi tracks. So you got two types of tracks. You got a lakeshore track, which a family owned. And then you also have, they call it a hinterland track, where you're farther in the hills. So access to the lake, access to, the waterways that were there, access to the big trees that are farther up in the hills. So with that said, those are cultural sites. Those are cultural landscapes. And like I said, the lineal descendants are setting in here. Some of them are setting in here today. Not only the uniqueness of this system was put into place from the southeastern Pomo, but also the language. We heard Dino talk earlier today. And like I said, I'm from two places. So my mom is Eastern Pomo. She's from Big Valley. And my dad is from Ilem. The southeastern Pomo, linguistically, they say is the oldest Pomo language. Kind of had a tree. And they said there was a proto-Pomo, which we all at one point just spoke. That was it. And people started moving, right? And the language changed, started moving, and the language changed. Linguistically, they say the southeastern Pomo is the oldest. It's the first branch off of proto-Pomo, linguistically. So two unique things about the southern part of the lake, of what it holds and what's a part of here. And definitely something that should be looked at, I think, as unique, and that the people are still here. It was so detailed that it actually had rules of when you can go into somebody's track and when you couldn't. And all those resources that are in each one of these tracks were actually used not only for the sustainability of their families back at home, but also to trade for the tracks that were next to them and the neighboring tribes. And so none of that, though, is discussed or talked about, except only tribal cultural knowledge that's brought to the table. And that's what we provide. That's what we provide. Like I said, the archaeological contract that you have for their report is paid for by the city to have him do what he does. The information that he gets and that he goes and he researches, he brings back. The information that I get, city doesn't pay for. That's free. That's free for the city to get a better determination on how sensitive an area is, how important it is to the tribe, and how can we mitigate it. Different tracks were used at different times of the year. We all know hitch, right? It was a very important part of our diet along with acorn. Kulbadai, which runs the creek that's right behind here, was an area that was significant, not only because it's in Khoi territory and it ran with the hitch, but on the other side of that was the Lem territory. And so when seasonal fishing time came, it wasn't just you stay on your side and I'll stay on mine. This is a time where communities interacted, traded, seen, and made relationships, intermarriages. So here in this track that we're in, it's a very significant place because it did that. It provided more than what we're looking at, just tribal cultural resources. It provided a historical practice of what we did within intertribal communities. And like I said, this was all documented by Gifford in 1923, after he was interviewing the relatives that are from here and also over into Eastern Poma territory for him to be able to create his map. So I just wanted to kind of, talk about the importance of that cultural knowledge that's being brought, that's always brought to the table when I go into consultation. That knowledge is an important part to make a good determination. When that knowledge is not taken into consideration, like what does it do? I think that's the question. What does it do to the community? What does it do? And I know for me, it hits home hard because I'm a member of this community. I'm born and raised here. Like I said, I went to Lower Lake High School and graduated. I played ball. I coached. I did all of these things that were part of the community. And asking and just saying, like, where's the inclusion? Like I said, there's things that have happened historically that now through consultation, some of these laws and processes we can change. But if we don't change, it's going to continue. That trauma will continue. And that's where we looking at what is it environmentally that this is going to do? Environmental justice. What does that mean? What does that look like? What are the perspectives of this? Like, what are the principles of this? What causes this, right? Next. So this was something that happened in the past. Cultural impacts and ongoing trauma. What happens when the footprint and those kind of things are gone? So you take a look, and this is back in 1959, and there was a settlement. My uncles and them were the ones that lived there, and Khoi people were the ones that's their place. And here, even though burial grounds were literally right next to them, development happened. Dam Road, we all know, literally went through the burial ground. This is, like I said, a lot of it is before laws that were set into place, and these are the things that, now we're starting to address. But what are some of those things? Like, what does it do? How does it make the tribe feel when either tribal knowledge, cultural knowledge is not being taken into consideration when it's brought to the table? The historical bad practices I showed you, when those things are continuing to happen, what it does to us, right? It feels like it's a form of erasure, like I said, and so there's our history that we can't regain once it's destroyed. We can't get that back. So it's a form of erasure of our footprint that's originally here. Historical trauma. So we've seen, we're just looking at pictures in the 60s. We see, what was happening in the 30s. We've seen what was going on in 1906, and it's historically happening. And from a tribal perspective, it's defeating. Because even though we're still here today, we're wondering, where do we fit in? Right? What does it do to us, right? As far as the Native communities, if we don't see anything where we're included as part of what goes on and happens within the city that we play for, coach for, that are a part of when we're over here spending money, what happens, right? Mentally and physically, we have issues with that. Historical trauma is an issue, that we're still trying to get past. We're still trying to deal with those things. Some of our elders are still going through those things. Boarding schools. We all know some of the stuff that we've been hearing about the boarding schools. They're finding, human remains of children that never made it back home. And it's some of that trauma that has happened to our communities that are here. And so with these laws and inclusion and in taking into consideration what the tribe brings to the table and to know that we're a part of this community is very important. We have a place that's out here and it's called Lewis Ridge and was discussed about this before, right? So Lewis Ridge is named after Mr. Lewis, Paul Lewis. And this was the gentleman that was the real estate agent or owner or real estate agent, that actually went and said, well, I want this land. This is my land and you guys got to go. And basically put his cable through people's houses and pulled them down. Nothing legal, nothing, just went and did it. And he's actually quoted and saying this in the San Francisco Examiner on April 6, 1959. Mr. Lewis said he didn't know what he'd do if the families rebuilt the cabins. He said, I would have burned them down yesterday, but it was too windy. And here, our relatives, our kids are standing by. One of my uncles, who was around 87 at the time, he was quoted in the Press Democrat, April 6, 1959. Mr. Salvador said many times that he wanted to be buried near his mother, father, and grandfather. And he said that he intends to come back to his Aboriginal home, even if some modern laws force him to leave, because their burial grounds are right there. And he was 87 at the time. So you got to remember, how old was his grandfather? And that was the connection that they had. And once this happened and they were gone, there's been no Khoi people back there. And so the footprint that lies, I think, within Lake County here and the other tribal footprints, like I said, in the land acknowledgement, it was great because it was accurate. In the city of Clearlake's territory, you have 3 tribes. You have Alem, you have Khoi, and you have Lake Miwok. All areas. And then there's some areas that are shared territories. So in the area where we're at, we're in Khoi territory. Other side, there's another little creek that we called Kalai. It's Alem territory. And so it's those things, I think, that we have to kind of keep in mind. And so I just want to state that under environmental justice, the state of California, it's the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. That's what environmental justice is in the state of California. The benefits of environmental justice are not only the protection of human health and the environment for everyone, but also ensures that all people are treated fairly and given the opportunity to participate meaningfully in the development and implementation and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so I think with that said, that's one of the things to keep in mind That's what environmental justice is making sure that, you know what, everyone is a part of industrialization, of, development, like those kind of things, and not the erasure. Next slide, please. So the continuance of traditional knowledge and land use. So this is what I was talking about today. Like the tracks that I showed you earlier. These things aren't something of the past, and that they're just being, something that's in an old report. These things are still happening today. So thousands of years of traditional and ecological knowledge is being passed down. Like I said, I'm still going to the places where my grandfather told me to go and pick or to go and gather. We're still making those family pilgrimages, right, over to the coast to get the traditional foods that we need for ceremony and other things that we do. The knowledge of like how to use the environment, making tule boats, and other things traditionally that we had. It's all still being utilized today. Gathering plants, traditional plants, ceremonial events, those things are still happening. Still naming our newborns, still, having ceremony and world renewal ceremony in the springtime, and another one, towards the winter time. And like I said, working with our environment, what's out there. So I think the important thing is just to remember that, the traditional and the cultural ways are not lost. They're still utilized today. Those areas that are of significance are still important to us today. That knowledge that we have on the environment, where those are, how we want those dealt with, are all brought to the consultation table, not to deter projects, but to actually combine, I think, with, to be proactive in making sure that, with development, there's also sincerity, I think, about the tribal cultural resources that are here in the land. So the tools of, the next slide. So tools of substantial evidence of TCRs that tribes may bring to the consultation table. So as we were talking about earlier, cultural analysis, that's the information that I bring to the table. That is not in the reports, that is not in anything else, but the tribal cultural knowledge. Maps that we bring that is not paid for from the city to the consultation table to let them see scientifically what the state of California is saying how sensitive an area is. LiDAR, using new formats, new technologies to be able to establish and understand the sensitivity of certain areas. GPS, being able to not only see what is what has been found, but also now to locate or even to note while we're out there what we're finding for a more complete picture of sensitivity. Historical information, we go down to the universities, we go down to Sonoma State, the Chris Center, getting all of that information, cultural information. That's what we bring. We're bringing to the table, the consultation table, the cultural information that, like I said, that are not in those reports. Ethnographic information. That information that's put into these is just scratching the information that is actually in the reports or any of these publications that's happened. The more complete data that you get are going to be from the tribe, because we're still doing those practices. Some of those practices are still happening. And TEK, right? That traditional cultural knowledge that we have, or ecological knowledge that we have. We're still using the land. We're still gathering. The tools that help us with all of these, review of environmental documents, we're able to see that what's being provided from the archaeologists and in these initial studies. Development and review of mitigation measures. And once those things are all brought to the table, we can all determine on whether or not they're sufficient enough, or what do we got to do to make them sufficient. Review cultural and archaeological reports. Take a look and see what those look like. We need to see and understand the difference between archaeological and tribal cultural. protect, project redesign, and assistance. Definitely something that happens very early on in the case in a project. If we can get there early on and we know that an area is definitely sensitive, we can have a redesign. It's been done. I've been on multiple projects where a redesign has happened. Expert knowledge to inform consultants and decision makers. I think that's what TIPOs do. That's our expertise as tribal cultural resources. In answering questions and consultation regarding TCRs, and always and ways to properly identify, avoid, preserve, and mitigate. That's the first thing, is to preserve in place. And like I said, if we can't get there, then we have to figure out other mitigation measures. And like I said, you know, the coordination here is proactive in development, and what are mitigation measures that can make that project go through. We just got to be on the same page. And so with these laws, it helps us actually to be able now to be at the same table at the same time to come up with basically a really good mitigation measure that everyone feels good with when we're walking away from it. So I think for me, that's all that I have for you today. I just wanted to say, you know, thank you for giving me the opportunity as far as in this workshop to give the tribal perspective. Get in more detail, I think, exactly what those 4 categories are. You know, what tribes are looking at, what tribes are bringing to the consultation table, the importance of understanding and knowing what that information is, and knowing the importance of it, and that what is significant to the tribe is not always significant to either the city or the agency. But at some point, there's got to be where we're working together, because no one's going anywhere. City's not going anywhere. The tribe's not going anywhere. And the better and more often that we can establish, that's why we're, you know, pushing guidelines, processes, protocols that everyone feels happy with, that everyone will follow. New employees that come in, all they got to do is look at this protocol, that this will be something that everyone feels happy with. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gary. We appreciate your presentation. Is there any questions for Mr. Gary at this time?
Lisa,
I think you covered it, sir. I
Yeah.
see no questions.
I think, Lisa, did you have anything? Is she still?
No, I thank you so much, Robert, for providing that perspective. I think it just underscores the importance of archaeologists and tribal experts working together. And I feel like we're on the right path. And there's been a lot more coordination lately, and I'm just really grateful to see this. Thank you so much again, everybody, for giving us this time and space to be able to share this information with you. I hope you learned something. I hope it's helpful. I would love to hear any feedback that you have. If anybody cares to share what they've taken away from this, I think everybody would love to hear.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I think we're all grateful for presentation both you and Robert made today. I think we're a little wiser because of it, and I think we can move forward in a better light and collaboration. We do have another couple of items on our agenda. So again, if there's not any other questions, I will move on to item D, which is the consent agenda. Any other questions? Very good. Moving on to item D, consent agenda. Does anybody have any questions about the consent agenda? Seeing none, do I have a motion? Or do I have any public input on the consent agenda? Or would you like to have the item heard? Very good. Seeing none, do I have a motion?
I move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
I'll second that.
I have a motion by Council Member Slotin and a second by Council Member Kramer. All those in favor signify by saying aye or nay.
Aye.
Aye. Let's see if we have our voting open.
I don't know. I didn't see it there.
Are we going to have an electronic vote, Madam Clerk? We are.
Yeah. All right. That's it.
All right. Has everybody voted?
Motion passes with unanimous vote of the council.
Very good. We'll close some streets and have a parade tomorrow. Seeing no other business, I'd like to adjourn this meeting at 11:48 a.m. We're adjourned. Thank you all for coming.